broken man, ready to give up on life, stands on the edge, his past haunting him. But just as he prepares to step into the darkness, a voice from his past calls out, shattering everything he thought he knew. Before we unravel this powerful story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more heart-wrenching tales that will stay with you long after they end. The cold, sterile waiting room felt suffocating. Noah Caldwell, a 56-year-old former Marine, sat hunched in an uncomfortable chair, his tired, brittle body sagging like it might collapse at any moment. He was a ghost of the man he once was, once full of strength, now a hollow shell, drained by illness and regret. His pale hands gripped the worn armrests, knuckles turning white, but he barely noticed. His eyes were too focused on the dim lighting, the flickering of fluorescent bulbs overhead, and the soft, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. It was a sound that had become a constant companion in his life, a reminder that he was alive. But for how long? The faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the musty scent of worn-out chairs. His eyes scanned the room, catching glimpses of other veterans scattered around. They sat in silence, eyes vacant, lost in their own worlds of pain. Noah wasn't sure if they saw each other, or if they even cared. They were all fighting their own battles, some against wounds, others against time. Noah leaned back in his chair, trying to ease the pain in his bones. He hadn't eaten in hours, and the hunger gnawed at him, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness in his chest. Cancer. It had taken his body in ways the war never could. He didn't want to think about it, but it was hard not to. The doctors had told him it was from the burn pits, the toxic fumes from the fires they used to dispose of everything in the desert. Plastics, chemicals, even human waste. It didn't matter back then. He was too busy fighting the enemy to think about the poison in the air. But now, here he was, frail, wasting away. The cancer had taken root deep inside, and nothing was working. His mind drifted back, like it often did, to the past. The Gulf War. He could almost taste the dust on his tongue, the dry heat that never left your skin, the constant tension in the air. He could still hear the distant gunfire, the screams of his brothers in arms. Men who never made it back. Eddie, his best friend, the one he promised to look after, the one whose dog tags he still wore around his neck, even though they felt like a weight he couldn't carry anymore. He had promised Edie he'd take care of his family if anything happened to him, but Noah had failed. He had failed Edie, and now he was failing himself. Noah closed his eyes, trying to push the memories away, but they wouldn't leave. The smell of the burn pits, the fire, the thick black smoke that clouded everything. He had been surrounded by it, breathing it in, never knowing it would slowly destroy him from the inside out. The door to the waiting room creaked open, pulling Noah back into the present. Dr. Collins stepped inside, his face grim, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Caldwell," the doctor began, his voice soft but professional, "I have the results from your latest tests." Noah didn't need to hear the words. He knew what was coming. "The chemotherapy, it's not working," Dr. Collins continued, his gaze not meeting Noah's. "We've seen no significant improvement." Noah's heart sank. He had known deep down, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. The promise of treatment, the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could fight this. And now, it felt like it was slipping away. "But there's still one option," Dr. Collins said, lifting his gaze, eyes full of hope. "There's a new treatment, cell therapy. It's been shown to help in cases like yours." Noah didn't even let the doctor finish. "And let me guess," Noah cut him off, his voice ragged. "It's not covered." Dr. Collins paused, then nodded. "Unfortunately, no. It's an expensive treatment and the VA doesn't cover it." A bitter laugh escaped Noah's lips. "Of course. The system never has enough for guys like me." The doctor's eyes softened. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand how frustrating this is, but there's still time to try something." "No." Noah's voice was sharp now, cutting through the doctor's words. "I'm done. I've had enough." The doctor looked taken aback, but Noah didn't care. He wasn't here for false hope. "Doc, you don't get it," Noah continued, his hands gripping the armrests tighter. "I've been fighting my whole damn life. First it was in the desert, then it was at home, with my family. And now I'm fighting a battle I can't win. I'm done." Dr. Collins took a step back, his expression conflicted. He knew the signs. He knew when someone had given up. "I won't be a burden anymore," Noah muttered, looking at the floor. "I've got some pills to take care of that." The doctor didn't stop him. Instead, he just nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Noah sat there for a long time, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if it was the cancer or the life he'd lived, but in that moment, he couldn't see a way out. And that's when he made up his mind. It was time to go. Noah's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he left the hospital. The air outside was sharp, biting into his skin, but it didn't matter. He barely felt the cold. He was numb in more ways than one. His one-bedroom apartment in the run-down veteran housing complex wasn't far, but the journey felt longer with each step. It always did. The cluttered streets of the city blurred around him, faces passing by without a second glance. People too busy with their own lives to notice a man like him. When he finally reached the apartment building, the familiar smell of old carpet and damp walls hit him. He trudged up the stairs, his legs stiff and heavy. Each movement felt like it took everything he had left. Opening the door, he was met with the usual sight. Nothing much had changed. The walls were bare except for the peeling paint, and the faint hum of the refrigerator reminded him how little he had to eat. On the small table near the door, an eviction notice caught his eye. Final warning, late rent. The paper seemed to mock him, sitting there like it had always been waiting. A reminder that the system, the same one he had fought for, had already cast him aside. He didn't even bother to sit down. He just walked over to the mirror, leaning against the cracked edge of the sink. The face staring back at him was unrecognizable. His eyes were sunken, the skin so pale it looked like it might crack. His beard was unkempt, dark stubble covering the sharp lines of his face. The man in the mirror didn't look like the soldier who once held the flag high. That man was long gone. How had he gotten here? He didn't have time for that thought to linger. Instead, he dragged himself to the fridge, hoping to find something to eat. The shelves were empty except for a half-drunk bottle of whiskey and a couple of expired bottles of medication. Not even a can of beans. That was the reality now. His hands shook as he closed the fridge and reached into his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of the Marine jacket hanging from the back of the door. It was the only thing that still held any meaning to him anymore. His fingers brushed over the worn-out fabric, the jacket, the last piece of him that still mattered. Then his hand reached into his other pocket, pulling out the dog-eared photo of Jane. He hadn't seen her in years, but there she was. 10 years old, smiling in the picture, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's heart. That smile haunted him every day. He had failed her. He had failed them both. Noah's eyes blurred for a moment as he stared at the photo. He hadn't been able to make things right. He hadn't even tried. Not in the way he should have. The farewell letter he had written to Jane, tucked into his back pocket, felt like a weight. He had never intended to send it. He never thought he would get the chance to. With a sigh, Noah turned away from the mirror, his movements slow as he put the photo back in his pocket and grabbed the letter. Tonight was it. It had to be. Outside, the air was colder. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as he walked towards his usual spot. The busy street corner near the bus terminal was full of noise, honking cars, rushing pedestrians, and the endless murmur of city life. But to Noah, it was all background noise. This was where he had ended up. The corner where he spent hours every day holding up a tattered sign that read, "Veteran in need. Anything helps." He didn't expect much. It was just a way to pass the time, a way to feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible. But today felt different. People walked by, eyes sliding over him. They didn't stop. They didn't care. A few tossed some change into his cup, but it didn't make him feel any better. The usual muttered insults were louder today. "Get a job," one person called. "Lazy bastard," another muttered as they passed. Noah gripped the sign tighter, the paper crinkling in his hands. His pride was long gone, but the anger still burned. Anger at himself, at the system, at everything that had gone wrong. He wasn't just begging for money. He was begging for dignity, for someone to look at him and see the man he once was. But no one did. A wealthy businessman in a suit walked by, sneering as he glanced at Noah. "I served too," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Never had to beg. Maybe you just didn't try hard enough." Noah swallowed the bitterness in his throat. It wasn't just the words. It was the entitlement behind them. The man had no idea what it felt like to sacrifice, to lose everything, to watch your body and mind crumble under the weight of it all. Then it happened. A teenager, barely more than a kid, walked up with a phone in hand. "Hey, look at this," the kid said, laughing. An actual vet begging for money. He zoomed in on Noah's face, recording. Noah didn't move. Then, the cup of coffee. The kid threw it onto him, laughing louder as the liquid splashed across his lap. The heat stung, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt in that moment. It was the final blow, the last reminder that he was nothing more than an afterthought, a disposable thing. Noah stood there, drenched and numb. His heart was a lead weight in his chest. The coffee burned, but it was nothing compared to the fire of regret that raged inside him. He looked around at the people walking by, too busy to care, too focused on their own lives to notice the man who had once been part of something bigger. Tonight was the night. The cold wind whipped around Noah as he walked, pushing against him, as if trying to stop him. But he didn't care anymore. He barely felt the chill anymore. Every step took him closer to the Golden Gate Bridge, closer to the end. The city's lights flickered in the distance, casting a dull glow over the darkened waters below. They seemed so far away, like the world he was about to leave behind. The hum of the traffic, the buzz of the city, none of it mattered. It was just noise now. Nothing could drown out the thoughts swirling in his mind. As he reached the bridge, he stopped, looking down at the river below. The vast expanse of water stretched out before him, dark and endless, just like the emptiness inside him. His hands, shaking slightly, reached out to grip the cold metal of the railing. He leaned forward, feeling the wind tear through his clothes, biting at his skin. The sound of his own heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Jane, her face, her voice, her laugh, all of it flooded back in a rush. He could see her, a tiny baby in his arms, her big brown eyes staring up at him. The way she used to grab his finger with her little hand, smiling like he was the world to her. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago, and yet they were still so vivid. He closed his eyes. The pain of remembering was almost unbearable. Jane, please forgive me. And then, the voice broke through, soft but clear. Dad? Noah's body jerked as if someone had slapped him awake. His heart leapt in his chest. He whipped around, his hand still gripping the railing. He half expected to see a police officer, maybe a guard, someone coming to stop him from doing what he had already decided. But it wasn't a cop. It was a woman. She was out of breath, her face flushed with the cold, eyes wide and filled with tears, the kind of tears that made Noah's chest tighten. He didn't recognize her at first, and for a split second he thought he was imagining it, but then the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Jane, the world stopped. His knees felt weak, his mind reeled. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what he was hearing. Jane? He stared at her for a moment, unable to comprehend that the face in front of him was real. His daughter. The little girl he hadn't seen in so long, the one he had walked away from, thinking he was doing what was best for her, for all of them. Her face was no longer that of a child. She was a woman now, grown up, but there was something in her eyes that felt familiar. The same eyes. The same voice that once cried for him to stay. Dad? She took a step forward, her voice trembling. Her hands reached out to him, as if trying to pull him back from the edge. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of years of regret crashing over him all at once. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. It wasn't possible. How could it be her? I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I've been looking for you, I've been looking everywhere for you. The words barely registered. His mind was still spinning, fighting the fog of exhaustion and the pain of everything he had lost. But seeing her, hearing her, brought him back to a reality he had almost forgotten. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? He reached out, his hands trembling, his heart in his throat. Jane, He stopped himself. What could he say after everything? What right did he have to ask for her forgiveness? But she wasn't waiting for him to speak. She took another step toward him, closing the distance between them. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, pulling him close. Noah stood frozen for a moment, feeling her warmth, feeling the reality of her embrace seep into his bones, and for the first time in so long, he didn't feel completely alone. I've missed you so much, Dad. Jane's voice broke as she whispered the words into his chest. Noah stood there, unsure of what to do with the emotions crashing through him. For the first time in years he felt something other than the numbness that had consumed him. Hope. It was so small, so fragile, but it was there. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. He held her tightly, feeling her shake with emotion. His mind was still in a haze, trying to process everything, but one thing was clear. This moment, this woman in his arms, was the last chance he had to find redemption. And for the first time in so long, Noah let himself believe that maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Jane pulled away slightly, keeping her hands on Noah's shoulders, her eyes searching his face as if she were looking for something, some sign that this was real. Noah's mind was still spinning. The words Jane echoed in his head, but everything felt too surreal. He had never expected this. Never thought he'd see her again, not after the way he left. But here she was, standing right in front of him, her eyes filled with concern, a mix of anger and relief in her voice. "I've been searching for years, Dad," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Years. I couldn't give up on you." Noah's throat tightened. He couldn't find the words. He had never been good at this, at facing the consequences of his actions. His whole life, he'd shut people out, convinced himself it was the right thing to do. Jane continued, not waiting for him to speak. "I started at the shelters, I checked hospitals, I looked everywhere." Noah's heart sank further, the weight of her dedication hitting him harder than anything else. She had spent years searching, hoping for a glimpse of him, hoping to find her father again. "A veteran outreach worker at the shelter I contacted, she remembered you," Jane said, her voice trembling. "She said she knew a man who fit your description. She said you were sick, living on the streets." Noah's hand instinctively went to his chest, where the old dog tags of his past still rested. His mind was racing. He had known what he was doing was wrong. He hadn't thought about how it might affect Jane. But hearing it from her, hearing how much she cared, it made everything feel so much worse. Jane's face grew more serious. "And then I saw you." Noah blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. Jane looked away briefly, as if trying to hold back the storm of emotions that were threatening to break free. "I saw a post online, a video of a veteran begging for change at the bus terminal." She swallowed hard before continuing, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was you, Dad." Noah staggered back a step, his mind swirling. He had seen so many people like him on the streets, and the thought of his daughter watching him, not knowing how far he'd fallen, nearly broke him. He had become just another lost soul, and Jane had seen him. She had found him. For a moment neither of them spoke. The world seemed to quiet around them, as though it were waiting for Noah to process the weight of her words. "I knew I had to find you before it was too late," Jane said, her voice filled with urgency. "I couldn't just let you disappear. Not again." Noah stood there, silent, his heart pounding. He had thought leaving them was the right thing to do. He thought it would protect them from his demons. He never thought Jane would still care, would still want him in her life after everything. He had imagined that he was doing them a favor by disappearing, but hearing her voice now, everything changed. A flood of flashbacks hit him all at once. The night he left. He had been so deep in his PTSD episodes, the paranoia making it feel like everyone was out to get him. He remembered shouting at Jane, hearing her cry, feeling like he couldn't protect her anymore. He could still hear the crash of things being broken in the house, his own voice echoing with rage, the fear in her eyes and how he had scared her so badly. He thought he was doing the right thing. He thought she and his wife deserved better. Someone who wasn't broken, someone who wasn't a danger. Noah's breath caught as he remembered the last time he saw her, Jane begging him not to leave. "Don't go, Dad. Please don't leave." He had looked at her, his heart breaking. And then he walked out. Now, standing here with her in front of him, the reality of it all crashed down on him. He had abandoned his family. He had abandoned Jane. "Dad, I don't hate you." Jane's voice cut through his thoughts, soft and full of understanding. "We never hated you." Her voice wavered as she spoke, her hands still gripping his arms, steadying him. "We just wanted you to get help. We needed you to be okay." Noah felt a tightness in his chest, the guilt rising up like a tidal wave. He had never imagined it would be like this. All these years, he had thought they would be better off without him. He had never understood that they just wanted him to get better, to be the father they needed him to be. And now, standing here, with Jane's hands on his, he finally saw it. He had been wrong. He had been so wrong. Before he could say another word, the emotions he had buried for so long broke through. His knees buckled, and he crumpled, collapsing into her arms. The weight of the years, the weight of everything he had lost, came rushing in all at once. He couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came. "I'm so sorry, Jane," Noah choked out, his voice barely audible, breaking under the strain of years of regret. "I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, for your mother. I failed you both." Jane held him tighter, her voice shaking as she whispered, "It's okay, Dad, it's okay. We're here now." And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, Noah felt something he hadn't felt in so long: hope. Jane didn't let go of him. Not for a second. She held Noah's trembling body in her arms, her warmth grounding him in a way nothing else had in years. He had expected her to pull away after hearing him cry, expected to feel the distance again, the space that had grown between them over the years. But instead, Jane's grip only tightened. "You survived worse. You can fight this too." Her voice was firm, but there was tenderness in it that made Noah's heart ache. "You don't have to do this alone." Noah swallowed hard. Fight this? He wasn't sure if he even had the strength to fight. He had been running for so long, from the war, from his demons, from his own brokenness. He hadn't thought there was any fight left in him. But hearing Jane's words, it was like a spark, a small, fragile spark of hope. She slowly pulled away, still holding him by the shoulders, and gently guided him to sit on the nearby bench. "Come on, Dad, let's get you somewhere safe." Noah didn't protest. He hadn't had the energy to protest in years. Jane wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting him as they walked down the bridge together, away from the edge and towards a future he couldn't quite see yet. As they made their way to her car, Noah felt a slight sense of relief but also a nagging sense of guilt. He didn't want to be a burden. He never wanted to drag anyone down with him. His life had been one disappointment after another. Why should Jane have to deal with him now? She had a life of her own. She shouldn't have to take care of a broken man like him. But Jane didn't seem to care. As they drove, she talked to him about the future, about what was coming next, and how they were going to fix this. Her voice was light, but there was a determination there that Noah couldn't ignore. When they finally reached her apartment, Noah was surprised by how warm and welcoming it felt. The apartment wasn't large, nothing fancy, but it was cozy. There were pictures of them scattered around. Old photos of when Jane was younger, some with his late wife Vivian smiling at the camera. The walls, though modest, were filled with memories. Memories Noah had pushed away for so long. Jane sat him down on the couch, making sure he was comfortable. "I want you to rest, Dad," she said softly. "We'll talk more when you feel up to it." But Noah couldn't just sit there. He felt the weight of her kindness, the weight of everything he had put her through. "Jane, I don't want to be a burden." She shook her head, sitting beside him. "You're not a burden, Dad. We're family." Noah felt something shift in his chest. He wanted to believe her. But after all these years, after so many failed attempts at getting better, he wasn't sure if he could. What if this was just another dead end? What if Jane was just trying to make him feel better, just like the doctors who had told him things would improve, but never followed through? But before he could speak, Jane took his hand in both of hers. Her gaze was steady. "I know what you're thinking, but listen to me." Noah looked at her, confusion and fear in his eyes. He didn't understand. What more could she say that would make this seem real? What could she say that would convince him he wasn't just holding on to another false hope? Jane took a deep breath and with a glint of determination in her eyes, said, "I'm a senior researcher at a private medical institution, Dad. I've been working on treatments for cases like yours for years." Noah blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. "What are you talking about?" His voice was hoarse, as if the words were stuck somewhere between disbelief and hope. Jane leaned forward, her hands gripping his. "There's a clinical trial, Dad, for your exact condition, Hodgkin's lymphoma." She spoke with urgency, her voice full of confidence. "I can get you in. It's a trial that's shown great results, and you won't have to pay a single cent. Everything will be covered." Noah's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. He had spent years doubting that anyone could really help him. But this sounded too good to be true. "Jane, are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything, after all the disappointments, how do I know this won't just be another dead end?" She smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "Because this time, I'm with you, Dad." Her voice was steady, filled with a warmth he hadn't heard in years. "You won't have to do this alone." Noah closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. Could this be real? Could he really have a second chance? The thought was overwhelming, and for a moment he felt a wave of fear crash over him. What if it didn't work? What if he was just setting himself up for more pain? But then he looked at Jane. Her face was so sure, so full of the kind of hope that he had lost long ago. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. "Okay, Jane. I'll try." She nodded, a look of relief washing over her. "That's all I ask, Dad." Noah sat back on the couch, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting alone. He wasn't facing this battle by himself. The treatment started almost immediately. Noah had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. The new therapy was intense. Every session left him drained, more fragile than before. He could feel the pain seeping deep into his bones, like the cancer itself was fighting back. There were days when the pain felt unbearable, when he thought about quitting, about giving up on the slim hope that had finally come into his life. But Jane never left his side. She was always there, sitting by him through every moment of pain, encouraging him even when he didn't want to hear it. Through the sleepless nights, when his body trembled from the effects of the treatment, Jane would hold his hand, whispering words of comfort, telling him stories of when he was stronger, of the man he had been. "You've survived worse, Dad. You can do this," she'd say with quiet confidence. "I'm right here with you." And somehow that made it easier. Somehow knowing she was there, knowing she still believed in him, gave him the strength to keep going. Every time he thought about giving in, he would think about Jane, about the years they had lost and how far they had come in such a short time. Slowly the pain started to lessen, and there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when Noah felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him out of bed, to get him moving again. His body was still frail, still fighting, but there were signs of life in him now. The therapy was working. He could breathe easier. He could stand a little longer without feeling dizzy. He could even walk a few steps without his legs giving out beneath him. One afternoon, after another round of treatment, Jane took Noah's arm and led him to the kitchen. "You're making the soup tonight, Dad," she teased, pulling out an old recipe book she had found tucked away in the kitchen drawer. "It's been a while since we did this together." Noah smiled weakly. It had been a long time since he'd done anything like this, cooking, laughing, feeling like a family. They spent the evening in the kitchen, Noah's hands trembling as he stirred the pot, but Jane never let him go. She guided his hands when he needed it, and they laughed together over the silly little things. Like the way Noah had always insisted on adding extra garlic, no matter the recipe. "You always were obsessed with garlic," Jane laughed, her eyes lighting up. "Mom used to complain about it every time." The mention of Vivian made something tighten in Noah's chest, but he didn't pull away. He didn't shy away from the memories anymore. For the first time in years, he was letting himself remember, letting himself feel. Later, they sat on the couch, the evening winding down. Jane pulled out an old home video, one that Noah hadn't watched in ages. It was from Jane's 8th birthday, the year Vivian had baked her the biggest cake Noah had ever seen. He could hear their laughter in the video, the sound of little Jane's voice singing, "Happy Birthday," as Vivian playfully pretended to be too tired to blow out the candles. Watching that video, Noah couldn't help but feel the weight of the years. He had missed so much. But he was here now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be the father Jane needed. The days passed, each one a little easier than the last. It wasn't a perfect recovery. Some days were harder than others. But Noah was no longer alone. Jane was right beside him, and with each passing day, their bond grew stronger. They didn't need to speak much. They simply shared their presence, their memories, and a quiet understanding. One afternoon, Jane drove them to the cemetery. The ride was silent, the tension in Noah's chest building as they got closer. He knew what today was, and he wasn't sure he was ready. But Jane was there, her hand resting gently on his. She didn't say a word as they parked in front of the grave, but Noah knew she understood. They walked together through the cemetery, the wind gently rustling the leaves in the trees above. They reached Vivian's grave, the stone standing tall and solid. Noah stared at the inscription, the name he had said goodbye to so many years ago, Vivian Caldwell. A loving wife, a devoted mother. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he placed the dog tags he had worn around his neck for years on the stone. They had been with him through everything, through the war, through the years of running from his own demons, and now they were here, leaving a part of him with Vivian. "I found my way back," Noah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know if Vivian could hear him, but it didn't matter. This was for him, for her, for all the time they had lost. Jane knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "She'd be proud of you, Dad." Noah nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know if he would ever truly be able to make up for the years he'd spent away from his family, but he was here now, That was enough. As they stood to leave, Noah took one last look at the grave. This time he wasn't walking away, he was walking forward, with Jane by his side, towards a future he hadn't believed was possible. "Let's go home, Dad." Jane's voice was soft but full of promise. Noah smiled, the heaviness in his chest lifting a little more. Home. And as they walked away together, hand in hand, Noah knew that while the road ahead would still be hard, he wasn't facing it alone anymore. The road from despair to redemption was never going to be easy for Noah, but it was a road that had to be traveled, no matter how daunting it seemed at the start. It had started with him at his lowest point, sitting alone in that cold waiting room, ready to give up. The weight of years of loss, regret, and brokenness had felt like too much for one man to bear. But as his journey unfolded, he began to see that the darkest moments often make way for the light. Noah had faced not only the physical pain of illness but also the invisible scars left by his time in the service. PTSD had twisted his thoughts, made him feel like a stranger in his own life. He had retreated into himself, believing he was a burden, that his family would be better off without him. But Jane's unwavering belief in him, her search, her love, and her forgiveness, gave him something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The failures of the system, of the veterans' health care system, of a country that had promised to care for its own, were undeniable. Noah had watched as the promises made to him were broken time and time again. The VA had failed him. The treatment he needed was out of reach, and every step of the way the bureaucracy seemed indifferent to his suffering. He had been pushed to the edges of society, left to fend for himself, while those who had fought beside him were forgotten. But that's where the story took a turn. What the system had failed to provide, Jane stepped in and gave. She brought him back to life, not with fancy treatments or promises, but with the power of human connection. It was her unwavering belief in him that gave him the strength to try again, to fight for something that felt like it had slipped through his fingers. Noah's journey was also a journey through the scars of PTSD and the toll it had taken on his life. The nightmares, the paranoia, the inability to hold on to anything stable. All of it had clouded his vision, making it hard to see the love and support that had been waiting for him. PTSD wasn't something that just went away, but with Jane's support, Noah was starting to understand that he didn't have to face it alone. And then came the lesson of second chances, a theme that ran through every part of Noah's story. It was in the forgiveness Jane gave him, it was in the opportunity for recovery that the treatment brought. A second chance to rebuild what was broken, to reclaim a future he thought was lost. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't terrified of it. He was ready to embrace it. Noah's story, in its raw honesty, showed that even at our lowest, hope can still find us in the most unexpected ways. Whether it's the hand of a loved one reaching out, the possibility of a life-saving treatment, or the chance to rebuild relationships that once seemed irreparable, hope is always there if we're willing to take that next step. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more heart-wrenching tales that will stay with you long after they end.